Welcome back to Her Secret Diaries, a place where untold stories find their voice and hidden truths finally come to light. If you believe that every person has a story that can change the way we see the world, you're in the right place. Today's story is one that will challenge your heart and your understanding of compassion. This is the story of the nurse who refused to treat her. The hospital corridors were always cold, but that morning they felt colder than usual. The kind of cold that seeped into bones and settled there. Room 312 was quiet except for the steady rhythm of a heart monitor and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. On the bed lay a woman named Margaret Lawson, 72 years old. Silver hair neatly brushed. Hands folded gently over the thin hospital blanket. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, but determined. She had been admitted after collapsing at home, her heart struggling to keep up with the life she had lived. Outside the room stood Nurse Alina Brooks. Alina had worked at Riverside General for nearly 15 years. She was known for her precision, her efficiency, and her calm demeanor under pressure. Families trusted her. Doctors relied on her. Patients often said she had steady hands and a steady heart. But not today, because the name on the chart, Margaret Lawson, wasn't just another patient. It was a name Alina had carried in her memory for 28 years. Alina stared at the door handle, her hand hovering inches away. Her chest tightened, not from anxiety but from something older, something heavier. The past has a way of finding you when you least expect it, and sometimes it waits patiently in a hospital bed. 20-8 years earlier, Alina wasn't a nurse. She was a scared 14-year-old girl sitting in the back of a courtroom, watching her mother cry, watching her father stare at the floor, watching a woman in a tailored suit speak with authority and cold certainty. That woman was Margaret Lawson. Back then, Margaret wasn't frail. She wasn't pale or dependent on IV drips. She was powerful. She was the chief administrator of a private care facility where Alina's mother had worked as a nursing aide. Alina's mother, Rosa Brooks, had been accused of negligence in the death of an elderly resident. The investigation had been swift. The blame had been decisive. Rosa had insisted she had followed protocol. She had insisted that faulty equipment and understaffing had caused the tragedy. But her voice had been small against the institution's defense. Margaret Lawson had testified that Rosa had failed in her duties, that proper procedures were available and ignored, that the responsibility lay solely with the aide on shift. Rosa lost her job. The lawsuit drained the family's savings. Her certification was revoked. No one would hire her again in healthcare. The shame consumed her within 2 years. Rosa's health declined rapidly. Stress, depression, unrelenting guilt. She passed away at 40-5. Alina remembered every detail of that courtroom. She remembered Margaret's calm expression, the way she never looked at Rosa directly, the way her voice never trembled. Now, decades later, that same woman lay in room 312, heart failing, and Alina was assigned as her nurse. "Are you going in?" another nurse asked quietly. Alina forced her voice to remain steady. Yes. Professionalism, duty, ethics, those were pillars of nursing. She had studied them, lived by them. But textbooks never taught you what to do when the patient before you was the reason your mother died. Heartbroken, Alina stepped inside. Margaret's eyes were closed, but they fluttered open at the sound of footsteps. They were cloudy now, but still sharp enough to search the face above her. "Good morning," Alina said evenly. "I'm Nurse Brooks. I'll be taking care of you." The name hung in the air. Margaret blinked slowly. There was no flicker of recognition. Why would there be? To Margaret, Rosa Brooks had been a file, a case, a liability to manage. But to Alina, Margaret Lawson had been the architect of her family's ruin. Alina checked the 4-line, monitored the vitals, adjusted the oxygen cannula. Her hands were steady. Years of training made sure of that. Margaret winced slightly. "It hurts," she whispered. Alina's jaw tightened. "Where?" "My chest. It feels Heavy Alina assessed the pain, noted the irregular rhythm, and reached for medication. This was her job. Pain management, stabilization, compassion. Compassion. The word felt foreign in that moment. Margaret looked at her again. "Have we met before?" she asked faintly. Alina paused. 1,000 responses formed in her mind. "Yes, you testified against my mother. Yes, you watched her career crumble. Yes, you never once apologized." But she said, "No, I don't believe so." The shift passed in a blur of controlled movements and suppressed memories. Every time Margaret called out, Alina responded. Every time the monitor beeped irregularly, she adjusted. She did not falter. She did not neglect, but inside, a storm raged at the end of her shift. Alina retreated to the staff lounge and finally let her composure crack. She sank into a chair, hands trembling now that no one was watching. "What's wrong?" asked Daniel, a fellow nurse and her closest friend at work. She hesitated, then told him everything. The name, the trial. Her mother. Daniel listened quietly. When she finished, he said, "You have to request a reassignment." "I can't," she replied. "It's my responsibility. It's also your trauma." Alina knew hospital policy allowed nurses to step away from cases involving personal conflict, but stepping away felt like surrender. Like letting Margaret escape again without facing the weight of what she had done. The next morning, Margaret's condition worsened. The cardiologist discussed possible surgery, though the risks were high. Alina stood at the bedside as Margaret struggled to breathe. "Am I dying?" Margaret asked bluntly. Alina hesitated. "We're doing everything we can." Margaret gave a small, humorless laugh. "That's not what I asked." There was a long silence. "Yes," Alina said softly. "Your heart is very weak." Margaret stared at the ceiling. "I've lived a long life. I suppose I should be grateful." Alina felt something unexpected stir inside her. Not sympathy, not yet. Something more complicated. The realization that this powerful woman was now utterly vulnerable. Later that day, a young woman rushed into the room. Tears streaked her face. "Mom," she whispered, gripping Margaret's hand. Alina stepped back, observing. The daughter's voice was filled with fear and love. It reminded her painfully of how she had once held her own mother's hand in a sterile hospital room. Margaret's daughter looked up at Alina. "Please, save her." Alina nodded automatically. But the words echoed in her mind. Save her. Save the woman who had destroyed her mother's life. That night, alone in her apartment, Alina pulled out an old box from her closet. Inside were faded documents, newspaper clippings about the lawsuit, and a photograph of her mother smiling in her nursing uniform. "You were innocent," Alina whispered to the photo. She had become a nurse partly because of Rosa, to reclaim the dignity that had been stolen, to prove that their name wasn't synonymous with negligence. And now that name Brooks rested on her badge as she cared for Margaret Lawson. The following day, a critical moment arrived. Margaret went into cardiac distress. The alarms blared. Staff rushed in. Alina was first at the bedside. She assessed quickly. Ventricular tachycardia. Dangerous. Immediate action required. The crash cart was wheeled in. Alina charged to 200. The doctor ordered. In that split second, time seemed to freeze. Her hand hovered over the defibrillator controls. One choice. One delay. One mistake. And Margaret could slip away. No one would question it. The woman was elderly. Her heart was failing. It would be easy. So easy. But in that suspended moment, Alina saw her mother's face. Not the broken woman from the courtroom, but the gentle nurse who had once stayed late to comfort a lonely patient. The woman who had taught her that care wasn't about who deserved it. It was about who needed it. Alina pressed the button. Clear. Margaret's body jerked with the shock. They worked tirelessly. Another shock. Medication. Compressions. Finally, the rhythm stabilized. Margaret was alive. The room exhaled collectively. Alina stepped back, heart pounding. She had made her choice. Days passed. Margaret remained fragile but conscious. One quiet afternoon, as sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds, Margaret spoke. "Nurse Brooks," she said slowly, "your last name. It sounds familiar." Alina felt her pulse quicken. "It's a common name." Margaret shook her head faintly. "There was a woman. Years ago. An Aide Brooks." Alina said nothing. "I testified against her," Margaret continued, voice strained. "It was a terrible case. I've thought about it often." The air felt thick. "What did you think about?" Alina asked carefully. Margaret's eyes filled with something that looked like regret. "Whether I did the right thing?" There was pressure. Lawyers. The board. They needed someone to blame. Alina's breath caught. "I convinced myself it was justified," Margaret whispered. "But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I ruined an innocent woman's life." Tears burned behind Alina's eyes. This was the moment she had imagined for years. The confrontation. The acknowledgement. "That woman was my mother," Alina said quietly. Silence fell like a weight. Margaret's eyes widened, searching Alina's face as if seeing her for the first time. "I'm her daughter." Margaret's lips trembled. For a long moment, no words came. "I am so sorry," she finally said, voice breaking. "You deserved better." She deserved better. The apology was fragile. Late, but real. Alina felt the anger she had carried for decades shift. Not disappear, but soften. "My mother believed in this profession," Alina said. "Even after everything." Margaret closed her eyes, tears slipping down her temples. "I wish I had been braver." In the days that followed, something changed between them. Their conversations were quiet but honest. Margaret spoke of institutional pressure, of fear of losing funding, of sacrificing truth to protect reputation. She did not excuse herself. She explained. Alina listened. When Margaret's condition declined again, it was gentler this time. No frantic alarms. Just a gradual dimming. On her final night, Margaret asked Alina to sit with her. "Thank you," she whispered. "For treating me." Alina held her hand. "That's my job." "No," Margaret said faintly. "It was your choice." Margaret Lawson passed away just before dawn. At the funeral, Alina stood at the back, unseen. She watched Margaret's daughter cry. She felt no triumph. Only a quiet understanding of how complicated human beings are. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't about excusing harm. It was about freeing yourself from carrying it forever. Back at the hospital, Alina continued her shifts. The corridors were still cold. The lights still hummed. But something inside her was lighter. She had faced the woman who hurt her family. She had held her life in her hands. And she had chosen compassion. Not because Margaret deserved it, but because Alina did. And that was the story of the nurse who refused to treat her until she remembered who she truly was. If this story moved you, if it made you question what you would do in that moment between anger and mercy, then you understand why we share these stories here on Her Secret Diaries. Because sometimes the greatest battles are the ones fought quietly, in the chambers of the heart. After Margaret's funeral, Alina thought the story had ended. She was wrong. Grief has layers. So does forgiveness. For weeks, Alina moved through her shifts with a quiet focus that her colleagues noticed but didn't question. She did her rounds. She charted meticulously. She offered the same calm reassurance she always had. But in the quiet moments when a patient slept, when the hallway emptied at 3 a.m., her mind drifted back to room 312, to the apology. To the look in Margaret's eyes when she realized who Alina was. One evening, as Alina prepared to leave, she was stopped by the front desk. "There's someone here asking for you," the receptionist said gently. Alina frowned. "For me?" She stepped into the lobby and immediately recognized her. Margaret's daughter. She looked smaller somehow, grief carving delicate lines into her face. In her hands was a large manila envelope. "I hope it's okay that I came," she said softly. "My name is Claire Lawson." Alina nodded. "I know." They sat across from each other in the hospital cafe, untouched cups of coffee cooling between them. "My mother talked about you," Claire began. "Not at first. But after that day, after she found out who you were, she couldn't stop." Alina listened, heart steady but cautious. "She said you had every reason to let her die," Claire continued. "And that you didn't." Alina looked down at her hands. "That's not how it works." "But it could have," Claire said quietly. "You know that." There was no accusation in her tone. "Only truth." Claire slid the envelope across the table. "My mother asked me to give this to you if anything happened." Alina hesitated before opening it. Inside were documents, old files, copies of internal memos from the care facility decades ago, emails between board members, maintenance reports about faulty monitoring equipment, staffing shortage warnings that had gone ignored, and at the bottom, a letter. Alina unfolded it carefully. "Dear Alina, if you are reading this, then I no longer have the chance to say these words face to face. I have carried the weight of your mother's case for most of my life. At the time, I told myself I was protecting the institution, the employees, the patients. I convinced myself that sacrifice was necessary. But the truth is simpler and uglier. I was afraid of scandal, afraid of losing funding, afraid of losing my own position. So I chose the path that preserved the system and destroyed a person. Your mother tried to fight. I remember that now more clearly than I allowed myself to then. She asked for equipment audits to be entered into evidence. She begged for a review of staffing logs. I dismissed it as desperation. I was wrong. Enclosed are copies of documents I kept. I don't know why I kept them. Maybe guilt. Maybe cowardice. But they show what we all knew and refused to say publicly, that the facility failed that patient long before your mother's shift began. You owe me nothing. Not forgiveness. Not understanding. But if these documents can restore even a fragment of your mother's name, then perhaps my final act can be one of truth instead of fear. I am sorry, Margaret. Lina's vision blurred as she finished reading. She wanted to correct the record, Claire said quietly. She didn't know how much time she had. But she said, "You deserved this." Alina felt something crack open inside her. Not anger this time. Not even relief. Something deeper. Validation. For years, she had known in her bones that her mother had been innocent. But knowing and proving are different things. "These are enough," Alina whispered, scanning the memos again. "These are enough to reopen the case." Claire nodded. "Then do it." The process wasn't simple. Old cases gathered dust, not just on paper, but in memory and resistance. The facility where Rosa had worked had since merged with a larger healthcare network. Leadership had changed. Lawyers had retired. But documentation has a stubborn way of surviving. Alina hired an attorney specializing in wrongful termination and posthumous exoneration. She provided the documents Margaret had preserved. When the legal team reviewed the materials, their response was immediate. "This changes everything." Internal emails clearly acknowledged malfunctioning heart monitors weeks before the incident. Maintenance requests were delayed to cut costs. Staffing schedules showed that Rosa had been assigned double the recommended patient load that night. Most damning of all was a memo from Margaret herself, never presented in court, warning the board that the facility's cost-cutting measures may result in critical patient harm. The irony was devastating. Months passed as the case was formally reopened. Media outlets caught wind of it. A cold case in healthcare negligence resurfacing decades later made for compelling headlines. Alina avoided interviews at first. She wasn't doing this for attention. She was doing it for her mother. But eventually, she agreed to speak publicly. She sat in a small studio, lights bright against her composed expression. "My mother was a nurse's aide," she said calmly into the camera. "She believed in caring for people with dignity. When a patient died, she was blamed for systemic failures. That blame cost her career and, I believe, her life, the anchor asked. And now? Now we have proof that she tried to warn her supervisors about unsafe conditions. She wasn't negligent. She was silenced. The story spread quickly. Former employees from the old facility began reaching out anonymously, confirming what the documents showed. They spoke of pressure to stay quiet, of fear of retaliation. Public sentiment shifted. The healthcare network that had absorbed the facility issued a statement expressing regret for historical oversights and announced an independent review. But Alina wasn't satisfied with regret. She wanted acknowledgement. The final hearing took place in a quiet courtroom, far less dramatic than the one Alina remembered from childhood. She sat at the same type of wooden bench she had once occupied as a frightened teenager. This time, she wasn't powerless. The judge reviewed the evidence meticulously. The defense attempted to argue that standards had changed over time, that hindsight was influencing interpretation. But facts are stubborn. After hours of testimony and examination, the ruling was delivered. The court formally cleared Rosa Brooks of negligence. The judge stated that systemic institutional failures had directly contributed to the patient's death and that responsibility had been improperly assigned. Alina closed her eyes as the words settled over her. Cleared it didn't bring her mother back. It didn't erase the years of struggle. But it restored her name. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. "How do you feel?" someone called out. Alina paused before answering. "I feel like my mother can finally rest." That night, she visited her mother's grave for the first time in years. The cemetery was quiet, the air cool and still. She knelt, placing a small bouquet of white lilies on the grass. "You were innocent," she whispered. "And now everyone knows." Tears came freely. Not from anger this time, but from release. Weeks later, the healthcare network announced a scholarship in Rosa Brooks' name for nursing aides pursuing further education. The facility's former practices were publicly acknowledged as examples of systemic failure in training seminars. Alina returned to her work at the hospital. But something had shifted permanently. She found herself speaking up more during staff meetings when concerns about equipment or staffing arose. She cited policy. She cited patient safety. She cited history. Her colleagues noticed the change. "You're different lately," Daniel observed one afternoon. "Am I?" she asked. "Stronger," he said. Maybe strength wasn't about suppressing anger or pretending wounds didn't exist. Maybe it was about facing them, exposing them to light, and choosing not to let them dictate who you become. Months after the exoneration, Claire visited the hospital again. They walked through the nearby park, autumn leaves crunching beneath their feet. "I used to be angry at my mother," Claire admitted. "After she told me everything, I didn't know how to reconcile the woman who tucked me in at night with the woman who made that choice." Alina understood. "We're all more than our worst decisions," she said quietly. "But that doesn't mean those decisions don't matter." Claire nodded. "Thank you for saving her and for telling the truth." As they parted, Alina realized something profound. If she had chosen revenge in that hospital room, if she had hesitated with the defibrillator, none of this would have happened. The documents might have remained hidden. Rosa's name might never have been cleared. Compassion had not erased injustice, it had exposed it. Years later, Alina would share this story with nursing students during ethics lectures. She would tell them about conflict of interest, about professional duty. But she would also tell them about the moment when anger tempts you to compromise your integrity. "You will face patients who have hurt you," she would say, maybe not directly, maybe through systems, policies, histories. But your power lies in choosing who you are in that moment. The story of the nurse who refused to treat her became something more. It became a reminder that justice and mercy are not opposites, that sometimes the bravest act is not withholding care, but giving it fully. Even when your heart is heavy, Alina kept Margaret's letter in a drawer at home, not as a symbol of forgiveness alone, but as proof that truth can emerge from the most unexpected places, even from the person who once stood against you. And every time she pinned her badge to her uniform, the name Brooks shone back at her, not tarnished, not shadowed, restored, because in the end, she didn't just treat a patient, she healed a legacy, and that is where this story truly finds its meaning.